So, welcome Roakana. Thanks a lot for doing this Q&A. It's a pleasure to have you. If you could please introduce yourself and tell us what's your background in the game to start off with, and just tell us about yourselves, what your role was in Undying.
Well, thank you very much. It's fun that you guys set this up. Uh, as you know, you guys are calling me Roakana. My real name is Della Camp Seifert. I have been a designer / creative director in the game industry for almost 30 years now. Actually, Undying was more at the front end of my career, and I've been doing some other stuff since then. So uh, I was like an art major in college, didn't know really what I wanted to do. So I came back to LA and thought about getting into games. Well, actually, that's not true. I thought about getting into Hollywood first, and then someone gave me some very wise advice that made me not want to get into Hollywood. And then someone got me a job in the game industry, and it was like perfect hand and glove fit for me. Partially because I was a total geek growing up playing D&D and Call of Cthulhu and Top Secret and all those, role playing games back in the day. So I guess I was a storyteller and an experienced creator even at a very early age. So I got into the industry, and my biggest ones beyond Undying, I did Star Wars Battlefront 1 and 2. I did the Family Guy game. I've done some other smaller games, but those are the kind of the big top of the wave products that I worked on and released. Right now, I'm working with a small company overseeing a VR title that should be coming out probably around Christmas time. And then I'm also working on another project that's based on a book that we are trying to do fundraising for. So unfortunately, I can't do much talking about that, but I will tell you it is distinctly different than doing a horror game set in the 1920s of Ireland. But yeah, that's kind of my background. But like I said, I was actually an artist in school. I did, back in 90 to 95, considering a career in video games wasn't really on anyone's radar in any serious sense like it is now.
Nice. So you've been in this industry for quite some time then.
Quite some time. And I got the gray hairs to show for it.
What has changed the most? Like, how many years has it been? You said it was like 30 years?
30 years.
30 years. So what has changed the most in your industry?
Well, I would say there's probably a lot of things that have ultimately changed, but what I would say is we've, back then we were all just figuring it out. So it was very much the Wild West, and there was a lot of creativity. There was a lot of the rules weren't written yet, so there was a lot more experimentation. There was a lot more willingness to like get in and actually invest. Like, one of the big problems nowadays is no one wants to invest in doing stuff because they just want to show up and have like guaranteed profit, which I would say the kind of corporatization and kind of where the money is flowing now has changed very much. The willingness to take risk, the willingness to back a product and like see it through to fruition. There's also a lot more established, like, we just want to copy what's popular. So, Fortnite comes out and then everyone wants their Fortnite clone. So you're not seeing people create different things in the genre. You're seeing a lot of people copy the leader of the genre, not understanding no one's leaving the leader of the genre to go to your little game. You can just look at the pile of corpses that are Fortnite clones that never got anywhere, right?
Yeah.
Same thing when it's Call of Duty or whatever else. It's like, it's this constant thing where if you just try to imitate the people ahead of you, they're always going to stay ahead of you. You're not catching up almost ever unless you show up with some new innovation or you change the genre and get people to say, "Oh, I played enough Call of Duty. I want to go play something else." But, it's really hard these days to get people to leave their games to go to another game because of all of these things like game passes and all the monetization models. And you're not just choosing to go play a game yourself now. You need to convince all your friends to migrate with you, right? If you want to go, "Hey, I think there's this new cool multiplayer game coming out," you aren't going to really get much traction, and you're eventually going to go back to Fortnite because your friends didn't leave Fortnite, right? And so I see that as a real problem with encouraging creativity in the industry and actually creating new surprising content. It's now up to like the little indies to try to surprise people. It's not going to happen in the AAA space. The AAA space is very conservative. and they want to lock down profit, and it's dangerously formulaic, is how I would call that. Other things about the industry that have changed, I think despite things like EA Spouse, and despite things like it's almost like on a 5 or 6 year cycle where there'll be these horror stories coming out about what's happening in the industry. The people on Fortnite, for a long time, they were working 100-hour weeks, which is just like completely abusive and not fair to your developers. You're going to get a lot of developers burned out from that. And they do it because they look and say, look, if you're not willing to work 100-hour weeks, the next generation of kids coming out of college are going to do that because they can't believe in making games. And so it's kind of this cycle where, because we're not unionized, because we don't protect ourselves very much, you can really get broken as a developer. And I would warn anyone, making games is fun. That's the very dangerous side of making games, is how much they're willing to break you for their own profit.
Right. So it's it's been like gone over to a lot more hectic kind of like push out, try to profit as much as possible. Is that what I'm getting?
Yeah, exactly. And the profit goes to the executives. It never filters down, or it does not filter down in a predictable way to the actual people that make the games. It quite often goes right back into the pockets of the executives. You would like to think that if it's not going to pocket the executive, at least they have a huge war chest of money to develop new innovative ideas, but that's not what they do with it. They really don't want to risk very much. And almost everything that you think of that became the really big genres was risky at some point. You think about, Battlefield 1942, when it came out, was completely genre breaking, and it ended up being a smashing success for it. Right. If you think about the Matrix or even Star Wars, when they first came out, they were really high risk bets that, paid off and huge. But you look back on it now and go, no one would approve those, projects, sight unseen anymore. They would want it to be a copy or an imitation of something else. Right. So that's very frustrating, because even if you have a good idea of a new game to be made, there's this very difficult path to get there. I was making a game at Pandemic, and it was supposed to be a first-person shooter RPG, but that was before first-person shooter RPGs became all the rage. And my executives were telling no one's done that. No one wants that. That doesn't even make any sense. And then when Borderlands came out and a couple other games like that, and I pointed at those, the answer was, well, now it's already been done and we would just be copying. And so my window of time where my idea could have landed in the right place was narrow to just, my take is they just made an excuse for why they didn't want to do it, the whole time. But that's the type of thing you're up against, is they don't really look to the future and say what would be innovative. They look to the past and say, how do we capture even a percentage of that magic? Right. So anyway, let's get to some more fun questions. I know that's a little dark, but it is also, I think, important for people to understand that the industry is fun, but it can be pretty intense.
Should we move on to some questions that were asked previously, on the survey?
Surely.
And the first question is, when will the Undying remake come out?
Unless it is a fan-made thing, there will be no Undying remake that I know of. I don't believe EA would look at it as a profitable enough franchise to reboot. And I also know EA is very weird about how, when they retire a franchise, it's not even theirs anymore to a certain degree. I can't describe it exactly, but I know that even if you want to get your hands on some of the older EA things like Syndicate or those things, that it's actually a really weird way they're kind of controlling their franchises. And so they're not, I think it's partially a tax shelter thing, but it makes it very untenable to go back on those things. I would say to most people, be inspired by Undying and do something cool. I don't have the rights to it, and I would have loved to stay in the industry or stay in the genre and do more Undyings, but it was not to be. Just to cover it, they decided to put their money behind Peter Molyneux's Black and White and American McGee's Alice, and they kind of hung us out to dry, even when we, hit the shelves the first time. Like we won the best game nobody played of that year from PC Mag. So,
So it was
so
highly reviewed, but it simply no one bought it because the PR stuff wasn't there.
exactly, they didn't want to put any money behind it, and they were choosing other horses ahead of it. We actually heard from marketing afterwards, like, yeah, we should have put more behind you, because they realized that we actually did something pretty innovative at the time. But live and learn. It's too bad. I mean, there was a lot of very passionate people, and I thought, working with Clive on it was cool. So, say love you.
And the second question from this individual was, "What's your favorite food?"
Um, well, I actually love a lot of stuff, but I would say that I often go back to Indian food, Mexican food, and like Mediterranean food are like three big genres that always make me happy. I live in Southern California so that I can keep my Mexican food fix going. It just
Yeah.
it doesn't work other places.
And on the topic of EA, how was it to work for EA? Are they really evil, or were there other places that are worse?
Yeah, just because EA has a lot of problems doesn't mean there's other places that aren't as problematic. I think that they delight in letting EA take the slings and arrows. Yeah, let me paint the picture of EA this way. EA gets to hire in a lot of very talented people, and so I'm thankful for my opportunity to work with those talented people. EA is run by a bunch of executives that are tone deaf to what's going on, love to talk a big game, but really don't know games. I mean, one of the tours of duty I was at was when John Riccatello was at EA, and he didn't come from the game industry. He just perceived games as widgets he wanted to sell. And so, he came from, I forget which bakery company. It was either Sara Lee or Pillsbury or one of those, but he didn't even come from the industry. Like, he just, as an executive, he just saw it as selling widgets. And so that's what you got. You got a lot of widgets sold. EA crushes. They will buy up companies. I was at DreamWorks when they bought us, and then I was at Pandemic when they bought us, and both of those companies don't exist anymore. They are basically either just absorbed at EA, or they take the few pieces they want and they kind of let the rest of it go fallow, right? So DreamWorks, which was where I was when we were doing Undying, they really wanted Medal of Honor, and we were just that other game the company was doing. And so their focus wasn't really on us in that regard. Same thing with Pandemic. Just to go back, I worked on Star Wars Battlefront 1 and 2. I was lead designer on Battlefront 2. And Pandemic was bought because Mercenaries was the game that EA wanted from that. And because they didn't own the license to the Star Wars stuff, once things started to fall apart, then it fell apart fast.
Right.
I will tell you, just to be fair, I don't think EA destroyed Pandemic as much as Pandemic had some structural flaws that needed to be addressed, and we just didn't get them addressed soon enough. But are there some people there that are very problematic? Yes. I won't name names, but I definitely bumped into some real challenges on getting people to understand what's going on. A lot of people that were vying for power at all costs, and that was not great.
And that's very fair, because I feel like the meta today is that, fuck EA, everyone hates EA, everyone likes the shit on EA. And I guess they have kind of the track record to back up that hate, maybe. Or were they better at all in your days? Because it sounds like they were just kind of terrible, whilst other places had their own individual flaws. It feels like you're saying that in EA also was pretty darn bad back in the days as well.
Well, I've done two rounds with EA. I've never actually applied directly or I've never gotten a job directly with EA, but I've been at two companies that were bought out by them. I will tell you, it's in the evidence. I mean, EA bought us and Pandemic and BioWare at the same time. Pandemic's gone. BioWare is a shell of itself. I don't know why EA decided to make BioWare, who was one of the best RPG makers in the world, and said, we need you to do an action game now. Like, why would you do that? That's like going to, a Formula One racing team and saying, we need you to be football players now, right? It just doesn't make any sense. It's like, yeah, they're both sports, but they're not, don't have much in common, right?
Mm.
But look, Rockstar is notorious for burning people down. Ubisoft has a lot of controversies around them. Activision has a lot of controversies around them. So I would say that what I want to see is just more independent developers and smaller developers being able to succeed. Because I think it's just a natural thing once you are traded on the stock market and at such grotesque, monetary caps that that's just going to turn corporate. It's just going to turn into something where they just want, like, that's the other one. It's, you see this in movies all the time too. It's like, if each game doesn't outperform the last one, then you're failing. And you're like, dude, you're bringing in gobs and gobs and gobs of money, but they look at it as like a failure if like it's not all the money. And that's a huge problem, not just in our industry. I would say film has the same problem. I would say music has the same problems. It's just this idea that the people that are at the top just are impossible to satisfy as far as how much money they expect you to bring in.
Mm.
And there should be a point where you say that game was perfectly successful. We should make another. It made us enough profit that it justifies making more, and it's just never that way. So, you know,
Well, this question is very peculiar. I guess it's up for interpretation, but were you or someone else on the team harassed by Clive Barker?
yeah. So I don't know if there's rumors or stories out there of anything in that regard to Clive. When we worked with him, he was wonderful. He was a great collaborator. He was brought in because my art director at the time had a contact, and so we approached him. The game started out as not being associated with Clive. It was just a horror game. Steven Spielberg was making a horror movie at the time, The Haunting of Hill House, and he wanted us to make a horror game. And so it was really actually Steven Spielberg that kind of kickstarted Undying, because he's like, I just want a haunted house game, make me a horror game. And so we pitched this, and it got rolling. And then later in the process, we had an opportunity to say, hey, we can approach Clive Barker and collaborate with him. And it ended up being a really good collaboration. I was very happy that I got to meet him and work closely with him. I witnessed nothing but professionalism from him. And I just, I don't know if someone's trying to infer or there are stories out there. I am not aware of them. And I'm just going to leave it at that because I haven't gotten pulled into all of, all of understanding anything on that. He was great with us. That's what I can say.
I mean, it's up for interpretation. The question, if it's sexual harassment, if it's any other sort of harassment, I don't know. Maybe it's a reference to some ongoing drama or something like that. I wouldn't know.
Yeah, he was great with us.
That's the bottom line.
Period.
Yeah.
We thought he was awesome. We thought he contributed some really great stuff. Understand, he came in and looked at the game we were making and said, here's some ways I would improve it. That's one thing to understand about Undying was we were already a year into development. We already had the story. Patrick Galloway was not our lead character at that time. He called out that our character Magnus Wolfram, Count Magnus Wolfram, was too inaccessible. He's like, a count is royalty. People don't relate to that. This was like an older, bearded guy, heavy set. And he's like, that doesn't relate to people. He goes, make your character more relatable. It was a great observation. He had great observations about some of the characters we were introducing. So I really think he brought a lot of value, but to be clear, it wasn't based on something he written. It's something that he collaborated with us on.
So, it's another personal question. How is life in America, and would you like to live somewhere else?
Look, man, I love America. I live in Southern California, which is pretty ideal. There's a lot of great things that happen here. I like the food. I like the culture. I like the weather. Have I went to school in Seattle, went back to LA. I worked in San Francisco, went back to LA. Like, this is my home. But that doesn't mean I don't like a lot of other countries. Like, I really did try to considered living in Ireland for a while. And I still, maybe if I get older and have a chance to just go do something for 6 months or a year, I would do that in a heartbeat. I have traveled a number of places around Europe that I thought were amazing. I do feel a certain kinship with Ireland. That's actually the reason we set it in Ireland. Is I had just come back from a month-long trip to Ireland, and I was like, I'm writing a game here. I just loved it so much, and I wanted to do something. But I personally, don't love some of the fracture that's going on in America right now. I'll leave it at that. But I've lived a pretty charmed life in Southern California, and I would have a hard time leaving it.
What are your top 3 games / movies / books?
This is always a fun and hard one to answer. I will answer more along the lines of some games that have meant a lot to me or I put a lot of time into. Civilization is just like an ongoing evergreen thing for me. I love playing Civ. My love of games really did come out of like playing first person shooters like Quake back in the day. And so I would almost say the genre of first person shooters, when it's interesting and weird and surprising, is absolutely amazing. I played the hell out of Quake for years and years and years. I would tell you that Titanfall, being also in the first person genre, was just a masterclass. Obviously, things like Half-Life was also another huge game for me. Half-Life was an inspiration for Undying, by the way. So, and then I played too much World of Warcraft and World of Tanks and those type of games to really. It's an embarrassing number, just to say it that way. Same thing with movies. I love all genres. I think I would put LA Confidential is probably one of my favorite movies of all time. But then I also love Aliens, and I love recently I thought Everything Everywhere All at Once was just a delight because it broke the rules and said, let's tell stories different. And I'm always looking towards the new. I don't want to live in the past. And so I delight at what's coming, whether that's music or things like that. Sadly, books, I'm not reading as much as I should. The Game of Thrones, I read all those books religiously and before any of the show came out and absolutely was delighted and amazed by those. And, so when the show came out, I was like, you can finally see what I've been trying to talk to you guys about for all these years.
Yeah.
But those are good examples. But I like to mix it up. I'm not someone that is just a genre fan. I like to read, um, some nonfiction that I think can really blow your mind. Just to kind of give context. There's a book, I think it's Jared Diamond. I can't remember, a book called Collapse. Or I really like the Master and Commander series. I really like the Sharp series that's about a British soldier during the Napoleonic Wars. So I feel that inspiration should come from all over. And I think if you live just in genre, you're depriving yourself of a lot of inspiration that could inform you in different ways, right? I, one of the reasons I think we did some cool stuff in Undying was, Honor Us. We said, let's go look at a lot of, Middle Eastern architecture and how beautiful it was and how, at that time, everyone was doing very Western, you know, worldview stuff. A castle was always a very British or German style castle. And so to break away from that and to be inspired by less recognized cultures is a big deal. And I'm going to say one thing here, because one mistake we did do was we took inspiration from the Middle Eastern culture. And at the time in the late 1990s, we were not sensitive to or aware of the fact that some of the things we took inspiration from would become offensive to that culture. And I just want to say that was not intentional from our part to be offensive to anyone. If I could go back and patch the game, I would. But we use some of their art, in those cultures is actually written word, right? So in Honor Us, we were using the word House of God in there, and we didn't realize it, honestly. But I can see how that's very upsetting to that culture, and I'm very sorry for that. And it's not something I would do ever again, but we just weren't aware. Honestly, like the things that we were doing in the 90s, we were not aware of, and we should have been better about. But it was a different time for making games back then. Sorry, that was a rambling answer, but there you go.
My box copy of Undying has a review sticker on it, which has the quote, "The most complete shooter since Half-Life." If you could maybe just quickly touch on that subject or that statement and just give us your thoughts.
I am honored to be in, Half-Life and Half-Life 2 are like genre defining. They showed us that you could take a first person shooter and make it a narrative and make it surprising and make it horrific. That's why I said Half-Life was one of our inspirations, because it showed us that it's not just, look, I love Quake, I love Doom and all that, but those are real pure action experiences. They don't really tell you much of a story. It's just like more and more adrenaline, go, go, go. And to see Half-Life was eye-opening for us. So I'm hugely honored by that statement, because I have so much respect, and I just wish Valve would be making games like that still.
Maybe I should do this question in some other way, but does the original source code of Undying still exist, and is it available?
I believe that someone has the source code. It probably is archived someplace at EA. I don't believe any of the developers are still sitting on it in a way that would be accessible to anyone. I think it's unfortunate. I think I really liked John Carmack's philosophy of, like, when he was done making a game, he eventually made that code available to everyone else so they could learn from it, or continue to modify it, because he's like, by the time we give you this code, we've already moved on to the next thing. I think that's a really great philosophy, but I did not have the power to make that call.
Do you have recommendations for people that want to work in gaming?
Sure. Let's start with the positive stuff. um, so if you want to be in gaming, I touched on a little bit earlier of saying, really get a broad understanding of arts and culture and inspiration. I think you're going to find that you don't know where your inspiration is going to come from. And sometimes the more you know, the more you're going to see connections that you hadn't seen before. So playing genres, don't be devout to just PC. Don't do the PC master race thing. Console games have a lot to offer as far as how to streamline the experience and also reach a different audience. And I would encourage you to understand all of that. Train yourself to be able to communicate why something frustrates you, why something inspires you. It can't just be, this sucks. You have to be able to say, I tried to use that weapon. When I use it, I was frustrated because X, Y, and Z, because that's critical thinking. You're starting to break down the problem, and then you start to verbalize what solutions could be, right? And so you want to be in that state of actually being self-aware enough when you're playing a game to go, why am I frustrated right now? Or why am I enjoying this so much right now? And the hard thing is, really good games make the stuff you're enjoying look easy, and it's never easy. But the problem is, when bad stuff happens, everyone's like, well, why would they do it this way? And the truth is, that is not how any developer works. They're trying to make good games. There's probably a lot of reasons why things got out of control. And so I would just encourage people to realize that, even when people are making, games that are not up to spec, it wasn't the developers just saying, let's go off and make a bad game. There's always an exception to the rule, but in general, I believe strongly that developers' heart is in the right place. But they can still make bad choices, and they can still ship bad games, and you should be able to critique that and learn from it. And sometimes playing the bad games actually teaches you things that you wouldn't learn otherwise. Beyond that, depending on what direction you want to go, I would tell you, obviously, as an artist, you've got to really go get trained up. It used to be that you could slip into the game industry without much schooling, but I don't think that's as true anymore. I think you need to go off and don't get just video game art training. Go get actually that classical training that's going to help you understand color theory, help you understand, composition, a lot of things like that will inform you. Engineering, the path is a lot clearer there. You're really going to need to be a capable programmer. It used to be that we would have some hackers and some classically trained programmers, but I think there's a lot more expectation that you have some of that schooling there. We're still going to teach you a lot of stuff. No school is teaching you everything you need to know, because the game industry changes so quickly that we are always kind of on the front end and innovating on stuff. So, you know, I would encourage you just to get a very strong foundation so that when the changes come, you can shift with them. If you're only trained in one way of doing stuff or only in genre, you might not have the ability to adapt as quickly as you're going to need to be able to adapt. Adapting is a big, big deal. You're not going in knowing everything you need to know coming out of school. You're going to learn a lot on the job. And then for design, learn to talk, learn to write documents, learn to be an effective communicator, and how to listen to artists and programmers, because they're going to feel like it's three different groups of people mentally, but you don't want that to be a divisive thing. You want to be inclusive and get everyone to help make the game better. Um, the biggest lesson for a designer is you're only as good as your team. Your ideas could be really interesting and brilliant, but if your team is not convinced or they're not capable of doing it, move toward what your team's strength is rather than trying to force them to do something you think is all about you. A lot of young designers think it's all their idea that makes a game good, and I'll tell you, the idea is vital, but if you don't have a programming and art team that is going to get you over the line, it doesn't matter how good your idea is. Work with your team, find good, strong talent that you can work with. And if you have someone that's a really good animator, make sure your game focuses on animation, right? It's just one of those things. Don't try to force your team to be something they're not. The dark side of it is just learn how to protect yourself. A lot of young people get in the industry and they are super stoked to be making games, and they don't understand that they are going to get taken advantage of by people. You know, if you dig around just a little bit, you'll hear the horror stories, but the ones I've heard recently are, you know, the 100-hour work weeks for games like Fortnite and for some of the Grand Theft Auto games and things like that. Hopefully that's all cleaned up now, but in the past, it was absurd. It was ridiculous, right? They were working, you know, 100-hour work weeks. They weren't getting paid very well. And they were being told, well, if you can't do it, we can find someone else that would. So you're going to accept that low pay grade. You're going to accept those long work hours until you really start to break down physically, mentally, emotionally. You will get ripped apart. So know how to protect yourself. Know you should work 40 hours a week and come back refreshed. One of the biggest problems I know young developers do is they stay at the office because they're so stoked. But eventually you start resent being at the office because you've been there 12 or 14 hours. Get your 8 hours in, work efficiently, get good stuff done, go home, see your friends, recharge your batteries, then do it again. I know a lot of people like, I've been here for 14 hours. I'm working hard. It's like, no, you've been here for 14 hours. Like, go home, dude. Like, go. So anyway, that's a quick cursory thing. I'm sure I could go much deeper, but that's a good overview.
I am gonna ask you a bit of a touchy question, maybe a little bit political, but it is 2024 after all. You mentioned a lot of, like, you want to include a lot of people. It's well known that Clive Barker is gay. He's very outspoken about being gay.
Yep.
You see a lot of games in today's industry that start to add pronouns, genders, sexuality, where it explicitly states that, you know, this character is gay, whatever. They changed the language in Spider-Man. In the Spanish language, as you might know, it's all gender-based, from, I think, favorita to favorite, which sounds very weird in Spanish. And as you might know, nowadays, you know, Sony's Concord was a complete flop. And it was blamed a lot on this, you know, woke mindset that appears to be creeping into games. Do you have any comment at all about this, or what is your thoughts on, you know, adding more inclusivity in games?
I think we absolutely should be embracing inclusivity. I think that if you want to know about the people that make these games, like, we have a high profusion of people that are, you know, LGBTQ, and they are wonderful people to work with. They are inspiration. There should be no issues with that whatsoever. Regarding if you want answers about anything on Undying, I believe Aaron was supposed to be gay. Clive Barker did say, because what I forget if I mentioned this while we were recording or not, but, you know, he helped us transition from Count Magnus Wolfram to Patrick Galloway, and he goes, I want someone handsome, I want someone that people can relate to. And he said, I want someone I would want to sleep with. And I don't think that meant Patrick should be gay. He just was saying he should be a dashing, charismatic character and things like that. And I really, these things don't affect people. It only affects them because they've decided to be angry or they've decided to other people. And I have no patience or tolerance with it. I have no patience with the outrage over this made up woke phrasing. I do not believe there is anything wrong with being more inclusive to the spectrum of people that are out there and letting them see themselves in the games we make and in the entertainment we experience. And I find it utterly disgusting that people are making people feel like secondhand citizens, making them feel threatened, making them feel scared. It's unacceptable. And that's just, I very much believe that we are better as a culture when we are more inclusive and we have more perspectives and things like that. And the people that are threatened by that are trying to take us back to the dark ages, and they're trying to assert a fake sense of machismo or whatever else. And yeah, I have no tolerance of that type of attitude. It's something we shouldn't be doing. And I think that, most people's lifestyles don't ever affect you in the least. And so why you are, or not you, why people choose to involve themselves in what happens in people's bedrooms or choose to involve them in and making people's lives worse. It's tough enough out there. Games is one of those places where people are able to find community and find their identity and be understood. And I think it's really sad that now you have kind of a certain hateful voice showing up in the medium we love. We love playing games. And like, I don't, I know multiple trans people. I know, tons of gay people. Doesn't matter to me. They are good people and I play games with them and we have fun. Like, I see no issue, and I don't know why people keep on making an issue. It's just a very weak place to be.
A lot of it is very pronounced nowadays rather than how it was back in the 1990s. For example, with Undying, it wasn't really, out there, so to speak. It was included in the background more so. Do you believe that the inclusivity goes overboard at some times nowadays versus back then?
Look, I can see why that someone can make a statement like that. I would tell you that the reason why it was all in the background and Undying was because there was the generation of don't ask, don't tell. It was very much like you can't be overt about those things. You can't actually make that be something that you talk about. Um, are there going to be times where it's a little heavy-handed? Sure. I don't know. I come from a little bit of the basis. I don't know if you've ever heard this quote from Ruth Bader Ginsburg. They asked her, what's the right amount of women to be on the Supreme Court? And her answer was 9. She said, we've dealt with, 9 men on the court for hundreds of years. Why wouldn't it be okay to have 9 women on the court? It's one of those things where it's like, we look at this as like, well, it's always been this way. So when we give you a little bit, we let one woman be on Supreme Court, you guys should be happy. Women are 50% of this world, right? But they should be happy that they get a scrap, right? Same thing, like, gay culture has been suppressed for so long, or, we can say, oh, there weren't that many trans back in the 50s. You're like, you're right, because they would get beat the fuck up, right? Like, it's not like things have changed. It's just that people are more, safe saying, I feel this way, or I am this way. I don't want the suicides of the people that can't have the opportunity to explore themselves because people are saying, no, you need to toe the line and just be, be quiet, stay in the shadows, don't make a scene. I actually think is not, that works great for the dominant culture. It doesn't work great for the people that are experiencing that. I think that if you saw the movie Shape of Water, I think that they did a great job of trying to portray the fact that these people all had to live in the shadows. These people all couldn't have a voice because of the dominance of that, of the main culture at that time. We should look around and go, when you see happiness on your friends' faces when they've felt scared before, that's a victory. And so I get it. I get that sometimes it feels heavy-handed. I'm not bothered by the controversy of like, the World War One battlefield where they let women be playable characters, and they're like, oh, that's historically accurate. And like, well, one, not totally true. There was plenty of women that fought. You look at the Ukraine war right now, there's plenty of women fighting. But once again, it's just a game. It's just a place where women should come in and feel comfortable playing games. And if all they see is male representation, maybe that's not great. If we want, you know, our brothers and sisters, our friends to all feel, you know, that games are for them, right? And I would be very careful saying the status quo was this in the past, so why don't we just keep the status quo? Because that worked really well for some people and worked absolutely horrible for others.
We have another question in the chat. Who wrote the physical diary that came with the box version of the game? The game writers or Clive, or the writers with Clive taking a look at it? I thought including that physical book with background info not found in the game was awesome, so I'm curious whose idea it was and who fleshed out the characters so fully beyond what the game would show.
So it was a mix of a bunch of us writing that stuff. I think Clive probably did copy. He might look at the copy and give us some suggestions, but he wasn't writing the main stuff. I was one of the people writing that. John Galvin, who was a producer on the project, actually was very instrumental in writing a bunch of that stuff and really helpful. I'm pretty certain Brady Bell ended up writing some things. We had a lot of people contribute to that, but I think that back then those type of like you actually put stuff in boxes, and it was fun to like you'd get maps and you'd get cool little pamphlets and things like that. So I think for us it was kind of taking a lot of the writing we had done, and maybe some of it didn't make it into the game, and are like, well, let's find ways of infusing the experience for people, because we lost that. We lost the unpacking the box and finding some cool stuff inside there. It is what it is. It's probably not worth going back to the cost of goods model. But that was probably a team effort. But I think like definitely want to give a lot of credit to John Galvin. He was one of the guys that really did a lot of writing for us.
If you were aware of any of the details, what were the rough plans or ideas for the sequel, story, mechanics, etc.?
So I don't think we got to the point of really plotting out the sequel. I will tell you the things we knew. The guy that saves you at the end, sorry, spoilers, is Kaisinger. And Kaisinger you were going to end up having a frenemy relationship with Kaisinger because you were going to start going around the world and solving other problems. I know there's a question out there someplace of like, what were your big influences? And I just got to say, Call of Cthulhu is like one of my favorite role-playing games of all time. And that idea of you know, revealing all of the darkness and all of the eldritch horrors hiding in the shadows was definitely where we were going with it. And that Kaisinger was recruiting us to help him get back to the physical world, and so you had to kind of a deal with him to basically figure that out. Honestly, it was at that level of thinking. We hadn't really dug into the details of what that was going to mean, but he was going to leave Ireland. We were going to go to other places, and kind of have a little bit more of a globe spanning experience. I think that was something we were very enthused about, of like, where could this grow and where could this be? The other part of it was, the biggest cut, and I know this is also jumping to a question, was how much we wanted multiplayer to be a factor, and we just weren't able to get that stood up. I love that you guys are actually trying to do something now. But that was a big part of our plan. And then as things got messy with, finaling the game and figuring out certain things, it was just that, that was the biggest thing that was cut, that I thought was going to be too bad, because I think really focusing on a horror experience as a shooter experience and taking you to those places and having the mix of magic and weaponry was going to be a really cool thing to do. And we've seen games since then do some of those things. Obviously you see it in oh my god, totally blanking on Oh my God, what's the one where you go under into the underwater city? I was shocked, if you
Like,
do some of the stuff we were doing of like, hey, you had kind of magical abilities and physical weaponry, but they didn't really ever do multiplayer with it. And we're like, oh man, it's such a missed opportunity. And still to this day, you don't really have that much in that direction. A couple games have dabbled in that direction, but it felt like a big loss. Anyway, to go back to your question, we thought it was going to be more of a globe-spanning adventure. We thought Kaisinger was definitely going to be involved, and it was going to be trying to expand the narrative. We wanted this to become a series. It just EA made other choices.
which parts of development were rushed or under crunch, such that the team wished that they have put more time and effort there, and what would have changed?
So, I mean, things that happened, we had it, things changed when EA bought us because we had been in development on Undying, and then EA bought us, and some people came in and they started to kind of cut down the script and started to edit out certain things. And so I think it made certain things not make as much sense because the reason we wrote certain things in the script was because it was setting up things later. And when those were ripped out, that same person came back to us like, well, this doesn't make any sense. And you're like, yeah, dude, because you cut the lines that explained it. Like, I don't know what to tell you. We also had a whole Irish village that we wanted to build out that got cut. That was the Trsanti were supposed to have taken over the Irish village, and you were going to have kind of like a door to door moving through the village, trying to locate the people behind all of that. I would tell you there's a couple of areas I wish we edited more. I think that while I very, very much like all the monetary stuff, I think it was overbuilt. And I think that for pacing reasons, we could have been a little bit better on that. I think that we could have. So the reason why there's so many loads in Undying, the reason why there's so many locked doors in Undying, which are kind of almost tropey jokes now, is because we were making it small enough to fit on a PlayStation 2. We had every plan of putting this on console, and so we cut the game up prematurely so that we could actually get it on the. And then when it never launched on those, ultimately, I think the PC experience was a little bit more stilted because you couldn't flow. Like we could have had much bigger levels if we had just focused on PC, but the goal was to be on console as well, and I think that was regrettable. Other things should have been. I will admit, I think that the ending of the game with the Eternal Autumn and the final fight versus the Undying King just needed more time to bake. They just needed more time to be refined. They ended up being a little rushed. And I still like what we were trying to do, but I think if we had had more time to polish it, we could have done it better. Those are probably the big ones. A lot of spells got cut that would have been fun to, have back in the game. I know you guys have dug a bunch of those up. But we were really, really, we were shooting for the stars. We had a lot of really interesting ideas, and I think we did a good job on a lot of them. But there's always more you want to do. Like development is always like the thing you hope to do and the thing you release, and hopefully the thing you release is still something you're very proud of.
I'm a game developer myself. I'm curious what kind of environment led to the creation of a game like Undying.
um, so we had a really young and fun team that really wanted to kind of prove themselves. But what it was actually I had been on a game called Taifu for DreamWorks, which actually ended up being the inspiration uh, at the very like primordial inspiration for Kung Fu Panda. So I had been working on that game, and then when there was an opportunity to go over and get working on a horror game, I jumped in and said, I have an idea. I'd really love to pitch you on this. It was because Steven Spielberg said, I want to see a horror game. And, it really opens a lot of doors for you when Steven Spielberg says he wants to see something happen. People seem to really jump at that opportunity. So we really lucked out that because we had a little bit of cover, because Spielberg said he wanted a horror game, we were able to really explore what that could mean and where we wanted to take it. As we were looking at the games that were coming out, as I said, Half-Life was a huge inspiration for us, realizing that you could do horror tropes, that you could tell a much richer narrative. Up until that point, that had been pretty uncommon. And that was one of the first to really pull that off in a way that showed us what was going on. But we had a bunch of young guys that really wanted to prove themselves. We had a very talented art director who was as enthusiastic about making a horror game as I was. He introduced me to Hellboy, who is still one of my favorite comics. I really think there's so much amazing stuff coming out of comic books that isn't just DC and Marvel. I'm not dissing DC and Marvel, but go read Hellboy, go read Black Science, go read 100 Bullets, go realize that people are telling amazing genre stories out there, and that can be the heart of inspiration on a lot of those things. Everyone's always asking me what your inspirations were. Hellboy, huge inspiration. Call of Cthulhu and H.P. Lovecraft, huge inspiration. One thing I really liked that Clive pointed out about the game was he said, you guys are making a really interesting mix of romantic horror, which is vampires and Frankenstein and, the mummy and things like that. And he goes, and you're mixing it with cosmic horror. And that was an interesting observation because we didn't really have that awareness. It actually was something that Clive, with his more veteran experience, was able to look at and say, well, you guys know you're mixing these two genres together. And it ended up being a really nice mix because I think, some of the things moving around the manor house felt more traditional romantic horror. And then as that door opens up, the first time you see Honoros and the door flies away from you and you have the scarrow rising out of the ground around you and all those things, it really, I think we started to break expectation because everyone's like, oh, it's a haunted house game. And then everything starts getting weird. And you're like, oh, it's not exactly a haunted house game. This is going crazy places. And we started playing with time travel and we started playing with, alternate dimensions. And obviously magic gave us the right to do a lot of crazy stuff. Like we had a tech artist who made those flipping blocks work in Honoros where you could run across the air because those flipping blocks worked. And that was just inspiration. It was just a really cool thing. And I think there was a lot of say yes, as far as us saying, if our goal here is to give you this amazing kind of cosmic horror experience and to break player expectation, I will say that's one of the strengths of what that team did, and we did it together. A lot of people contributed to that of really ideating on saying, what if this is possible? Because if you look at the games that come before us, they weren't doing as much of that, right? There was a couple little tricks you would see, like Rise the Triad had those bounce pads and stuff like that, but people weren't hitting that yet. Now it's a pretty common idea to play with these ideas, but back then I think we were really challenging ourselves of saying, what could a first person shooter be? And we had great designers working on it. We had some very talented artists and animators working on it. And I think it was just a passion project for us.
What is the story behind Gwendolyn and her death, which involved Patrick and Otto?
So the way to understand what happened was Patrick kind of coming out of World War One he was a debunker of like superstition and myth. Like he was very convinced up until the point where he met the Trsanti shaman, who, by the way, is well,
based on Magnus Wolfram, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he was the model for Magnus Wolfram, and when we switched characters, so he was a debunker of superstition. He didn't really believe there was magic in the world, and so he set his sights on Kaisinger, and it was like, I'm going to debunk this guy. This guy's clearly a sham. He's clearly a fraud. And so there was a whole ritual that they were doing. I forget. It's actually based on a castle in Ireland that he was doing a ritual, and Gwendolyn was part of that ritual. I don't remember if we had more of a relationship between Patrick and Gwendolyn. I apologize. 20 years is a long time to remember. But what really happened was Patrick, thinking he was going to catch Otto in a ruse, basically was trying to make him look bad, and instead Kaisinger made it look like Patrick was responsible for Gwendolyn's death. And that's why Patrick was on the run and kind of shamed, and why they had such antipathy for each other, was that there was this moment where she died and he blamed Patrick for it, and Patrick knew the truth was Otto did it, which is why they have such a intense rivalry with each other. So that's really what it was. I apologize. There might have been a romantic link between Patrick and Gwendolyn. but I just have to admit it's not in my memory anymore.
And if you just want to explain who Gwendolyn actually was to those who are unaware, like myself.
What they were doing, and we actually, I think we were originally supposed to do a cutscene around this. I can't recall if it ever made much headway, but Gwendolyn was someone that was being used in a seance ritual with Kaisinger. And so it was set up that he was kind of doing this performance for an audience. I don't know if you guys remember who name, Ambrose. Anyway, there was kind of a real shyster magician back in the 20s who was doing kind of big performative things for people. We based it on that, of like this guy that was courting kind of the rich socialites and putting on shows for them and things like that. And we just said Otto was the real deal. Like, he could actually do magic. And so when Patrick tried to make him look bad, instead, Otto turned around and framed him for Gwendolyn's death. And Gwendolyn was the focus of the seance that they were doing at the time.
Which leads me to the second question is, how did Patrick and Otto meet? Did their hatred for one another start with Gwen's death, or was that Otto's latest scheme against Patrick and their relationship is much older?
Well, I think that it wasn't like a really long-term relationship. Patrick was starting to try to debunk Kaisinger's activities. And so they probably had bumped into each other a couple times before that. Patrick was dead set on trying to expose Otto as a fraud. And that's when Otto decided to frame Patrick for the murder of or for the death of Gwendolyn. So it was kind of a growing rivalry that turned into kind of a outright, you know, huge conflict between the two of them after that. And so Patrick, at that point, that's also why he fled Ireland, and then he got called back to Ireland, by his friend. But like, he actually was on the run for a while, and he only came back because he was asked to. So Kaisinger kind of had won that round and kind of drove Patrick into hiding until the beginning of Undying.
Aside from the multiplayer feature, if you could fix/add/change anything about Undying right now in an instance, what would it be?
I think I already mentioned I felt that, like, Eternal Autumn and the Undying King could have been improved as far as the polish on it. I think there's areas where I think the story could have been a little bit more polished, and that's just how much time we had to test and kind of refine it. A lot of things I would like to do were much more about, like, we were limited by the technology at the time, and I think that we could have had a lot more fun with, the next generation of technology that would have let us say yes to some things that we weren't able to accomplish. I look at some of the special effects now and it's a little cringe, but once again, it was pretty cutting edge and when we released the game. So I don't know. I think there's not now that the village is out, I don't know if I would put it back in. Although I really wanted to get sponsored by Guinness. I want to be able to have Guinness things on the walls and things like that. I don't know if they would have gone for that, but I thought it would have been fun. Yeah, I would say mostly I wish we had more time to polish and make some things make sense, and just really kind of bring home some of the meaning of the drama that was going on, right? I think that the fight with Ambrose could have been told a little bit better. I think we did a really good job of creating Elizabeth's presence, and so that by the time you got to fight her, you had been seeing her time and time again. But we didn't do that as well with some of the other characters. Aaron, certainly you were seeing because he was all around the house, and so when you finally build up to fighting him, you felt that you had a connection to him. But I wish we had done a good job of creating that connection to all of our villains.
All games have content cut to usually make deadlines. What content was cut and what content did you want to see inserted into the game that never made it? You kind of just touched upon this subject though, but if you want to reiterate it kind of quickly.
Yeah, the quick list would be, I definitely, we did cut a huge section of the game, which was supposed to be the Irish Village. Because we cut the Irish Village, it then made some of the transitions to Eternal Autumn and some of the other places we were going to different. Like we used the sea caves for the Trsanti when we really wanted the whole village to be the Trsanti mission. So that's one thing I thought would have been fun to play with. Who knows now? I do think for me, because I was a really big multiplayer fan, and I thought that what we were going to offer in multiplayer was going to be pretty eye-opening for people. I was really, really big into Rocket Arena style gameplay. And I was like, what if we took Rocket Arena style gameplay and use it for a horror game and had this really interesting, a little bit more narratively driven or more about play style driven multiplayer. And to me, it's a big disappointment because it's something I was really, really, really wanting to do. Fortunately, when I went off and did Battlefront, I got to scratch my multiplayer itch, but it's one of my biggest regrets is like not being able to do the multiplayer that we all had imagined. We spent so much time as a team playing multiplayer like Rocket Arena and the shit talk and the fun and kind of the extensibility, right? Because I love that you guys speedrun the game and things like that, but boy, like if we had multiplayer, the ability to build more and more maps, it could have had its own, much more extended lifetime. And that's one of the things I regret was I think that a game like that needed more time to build an audience to get to the place where a sequel was going to be possible, right?
What did Clive Barker bring to the table? How did they end up joining to begin with?
Yeah, so as I said, my art director had a contact. Actually, it's interesting. His friend Steve Niles wrote the comic book 30 Days of Night that became the movie 30 Days of Night. Knew Clive, and then he put us in touch, and so we started talking to Clive. And Clive, really came in as on an advisory role where he was looking at what we were already writing and really pointed out things that honestly are lessons that stuck with me for a long time, right? Back then, you would build monsters that didn't make very much sense. I was like, it was just like, yeah, it's a monster. And like he's like, no, tell me what their biology is. Make me feel like the Howlers was one. He's like, put just a bunch of like kind of dark hair down between their thighs to suggest that they're actual animals that actually have, that breed and have a life, that they're not just these weird magical constructs. Like a lot of video games just make up stuff and don't think about like the actual biology or purpose of these things. And he asked us a lot of questions in that regard. As I said, he was wildly instrumental in us changing the lead character, focusing on Patrick, making Patrick more accessible, more of an everyman. And I think that was great advice. He was very instrumental in looking through the story and just pointing out places to enrich it. And he looked at a lot of our creature design and gave us more feedback on that about how to just make it creepier and more unsettling. So I mean, it was a really good collaborative relationship, but it was also very much more advisory in its structure than necessarily him writing a bunch of stuff for us. He would more read some of that stuff, give us good feedback on that, or we would go over with just stacks of art and like, we're going to show you all of our creature designs and tell us what you think about this. So, it was really cool. It was very cool. He was, we would go to his house and he would walk us through like his gallery. Like he had three houses next to each other. One he lived in, one was his office, and one was his gallery for painting and doing stuff like that. So he was living a good life. He had these three houses right next door to each other up in the Hollywood Hills. But great advice, great guidance on things. And as I said, those were the main places he touched on was helping us with, story, character development, things like that.
In a parallel universe, where would you have seen Undying today?
Well, the thing is, I don't think any game is benefited by doing 20 versions. Like eventually you get to a point where like you want it to have run its course and then evolved to something else. I love seeing what they've done with things like Elden Ring and even Dark Souls and things like that. I think you could argue that there's some spiritual kinship with some of those games. I would have loved to have it turn into a whole franchise. I would have loved to have it be more adventures and more stories and be able to refine. But I also think that you should let those things like, hey man, after 3 or 4, let that be and go and do something else. I think eventually these games that keep on trying to find more and more ways of squeezing, content eventually just kind of dry out. I wish there was another Titanfall. I thought Titanfall 2, if you haven't played it, I think Titanfall 2 is one of the best shooters ever made. I was stunned at how good the level design was, how good the mechanics were designed around, and how much their world supported all that stuff. That's the philosophy I would have liked to have seen Undying have. And if we could have had a multiplayer presence and did 3 or 4 games in the franchise, I think we would have been really proud of that. Um, I think there are games now that I see as very inspiring. I just wish people could get back to a little bit of like what's horror versus what's action, right? I think we've lost having as many horror games. There are games out there. I'm not saying they're not, but most horror turns into action survival, right? And that's its own fun genre, but it's not horror. And I think we've lost that ability to have, as many good horror games. They're about mood and about building tension and also making sure that you felt scared and powerless in the face of the things that threaten you. And quite often, all of these games, like unfortunately, even Left 4 Dead by the second game, the characters were so powerful with their weapons. It wasn't so much like, oh shit, oh shit, oh shit. It was more hoorah, right? It was more like, let's go kick ass, right? And you're like, you lose something in that. And there's enough action games out there that I think that I would fight more and more to make sure that we keep in mind like what a good horror genre game should be. And it should be something where tension and mood and things like that really prevail. I also think that horror games should encourage a certain worldview, right? I think a lot of games say, do what you want when you want. So if you want to shoot the servants, shoot the servants. And we drew a line of like, not only did we not want to um, account for all of those variables, we also were like, dude, if you start seeing the servants, they don't help you anymore. Right? The whole game breaks down because they're not going to run up and tell you, "Oh my God, did you hear what happened?" If you've already killed Frank, Helen, and Jane, right? Like it just doesn't make sense. And I think that it's important for us to not encourage people to be kind of little chaos tyrants in the way they play games. Get them to live in the shoes of something, be in a place, and have those experiences. And I think Half-Life did something similar. If you shot the guards, they would just be like, "Yeah, try again. You're going to go back and have to play it the way we would like you to play it." And I think that encouraging the worst behavior in people isn't game development. It's kind of like keeping the bullies on the playground constrained. And I think the game should present a philosophy. It should present and take you to a place that has a sense of rules and it makes it interesting for that, not just a kind of a chaos playground. Or let those games be those games, right? I would even tell you GTA is not as much of a chaos playground as everyone acts like it is. There's an actual structure there that makes it have a consequence.
Were the Trsanti and shaman fighting for the Ottoman Empire?
Um, I believe they were not fighting on any side. I think they were in the middle of it, and they were. So one of the things I got really fascinated by, this is another big inspiration, was I got really fascinated by right after World War One was one of the biggest migrations of humanity across the globe, and with it came death and disease. Like that's when the huge flu outbreaks. I think it was 1918 killed tons and tons of people, and the Trsanti and the kind of malicious magic users at the time were using all of that death, using all of that chaos to mask or cover the rituals and things they were doing. Um, Very similar, and I know with Hellboy, the magician, Rasputin was working with the Nazis, but he wasn't actually a Nazi. He was just using their power. And I think that we had a similar philosophy of like the Trsanti and Otto Kaisinger were taking advantage of all the death and chaos to achieve their own ends in that. And what Patrick's team was doing in World War I was they were trying to go out into, originally they were trying to debunk superstition, but when they started to realize some of the superstitions were real, they were then trying to defeat those people. And that's why they came into conflict with the Trsanti. I apologize if I'm talking too quickly. But they came into conflict with the Trsanti because of that. And they originally were kind of trying to debunk and shut down all of the superstitions that were going on until they realized some of them were real. And so that was where their conflict was. I wouldn't say that the Trsanti worked directly for the Ottoman Empire, but I think that there were times where they were taking advantage of it, or they might have had occasion to work with at times.
Is Peter Roakana an Easter egg, the guy Jeremiah's mother was talking about?
Well, yeah. My real name is Peter. Delicam's my middle name. So they took my handle. I've been Roakana my whole career as far as video games go. And then Peter's my real name. So yeah, that's very much an Easter egg about me.
Where was this actually found? Because I have no idea where is this question coming from, actually.
I think that must have been in one of the journal entries.
Yeah.
The truth is, I didn't write that. I think John Galvin wrote that as a little bit of. There's a lot. If you really dig into it, there was tons of stuff buried everywhere in that game as far as those things. I apologize. I can't. I can explain them to you if you point them out to me, but more often than not, I'm not going to be able to list you all the things that got packed in there because I know they went nuts. You guys found a lot of them.
Were you guys competing with the Alice devs, and you kind of touched upon that subject earlier. There wasn't really a competition as I understood it, but there was a competition for marketing budget. Was that correct?
I'll give you guys a little bit more history on that. So the main reason we ended up having much contact with the Alice devs was Columbine. So Columbine happened, and at the time, everyone focused on video games, saying, "Oh, video games are to blame." And so we had a big meeting where I had to go up to EA corporate in Redwood Shores in San Francisco, and both American McGee and I had to present our games to the executives because they were thinking about shutting both of our games down because they were worried about violent content. There was this idea of we're never going to make mature games ever again, and we kind of walked through and showed them both of our games. And fortunately, I will give EA credit on this. I know everyone wants to just have, dirt on EA, but they actually looked at both the games and goes, no, there's no reason for us to shut down doing mature games. These are very clearly set in fantastic universes. They're telling stories that are not, they're not for kids, right? Like I got people saying to me, like, how could you make a horror game for kids? I'm all, would you let your kid go to a horror movie? Why would you let them play my game? Right? Like at some point, like it's pretty clear on the box and in the theming and the subject matter that we're making a mature game that should be treated like a horror movie. And so that's eventually the conclusion they came to, is like we should be able to, as a profession, make games for different people, right? Games are not a child's medium, but just like we have outrage generators in the modern day, talking about woke and things like that. Back then, it was the think of the children and why would you make violent video games for children? And this is what's making our children violent. If you want to know the real stats, since 95, violence in those age groups has dropped off a cliff. Video games actually probably deserve some credit for actually making the culture less violent than we were in the 80s and other times like that. And so, it's always contrived. Video games were picked on it after Columbine because movies and music had bigger lobbies in Washington. They could go in, grease the right palms, and tell them not to blame them. And so everyone turned their attention on video games. And you see it still today, right? The shit that just happened in Georgia was like, this is because video games are making our kids violent. And you're like, well, the guy didn't beat someone with a controller. He didn't throw a disc at someone's neck like a ninja star. He didn't clock them over the head with the console, didn't choke them out with a cord. He got a gun out and he shot people. So let's put the blame where it belongs, right? And stop obfuscating where the obvious problem is. And I know you guys are mostly outside of the US, and you probably look at us like we're fucking nuts, because we are. But that's one of the big problems that was coming out of all of that, was just them trying to blame us. So, I lined up with American McGee on that. We met. We, both had to present our cases. Fortunately, I think we did a good enough job that both the games continued to be published. As I said, I don't think American McGee had anything to do with EA choosing where to put their money. They put their money behind Peter Molyneux's Black and White. They put their money behind American McGee's Alice, and they didn't give us very much marketing, money as a result. And that's too bad. Back then, EA was convinced that the only games they were going to make moving forward were games with a celebrity's name across the top, which is, if you look at that genre back then, every game EA was making always was like Peter Molyneux's Black and White, American McGee's Alice, Clive Barker's Undying, Tony Hawk's Skating. They didn't do Tony Hawk's Skating, but it was always, because it came from Madden, right? It came from their obsession with like, it's successful because the celebrity makes the game successful, not because the game itself is good. Once again, fuck shitty executive logic, because that's so stupid, but it is what it was.
Lore question here. How exactly did Bethany kill Aaron? Did she receive Keisinger's help?
She did receive Keisinger's help. Aaron was that guy that was chirping in your ear all the time and talking shit, and basically he was kind of a spoiler. He was kind of a little bit crazy, a little bit like mischievous. And Bethany finally got sick of his shit and basically beat him to the point where she basically ripped his jaw off. And, basically the way of telling someone to shut up in the most violent way possible, right? That was the idea. And Aaron was kind of a spoiler and can then end up being even more of a spoiler once he became a ghost, because then there wasn't that much they could do about him. So in some ways, even though they beat him down, just like Obi-Wan, he became more powerful and became kind of even though he was fucking with people around the house, he was kind of the guardian of the house, and he drove Bethany away to the Eternal Autumn, and he drove Keisinger out to Honoros because he made sure they were not welcome within the house.
Why were there Jewish Siddur gathered around the monastery and the Covenant estate? Is the religion of the monastery Roman Catholicism or some kind of combination of different religions?
So I would say that it really was meant to be just a Roman Catholic, especially with the dominance of the Roman Catholic religion in Ireland at that, throughout its history. It was mostly supposed to be more about, and I'm not really saying we're targeting Roman Catholic either, but I would say I think our inspiration was definitely from monks from that period of time. What happened with a lot of those other things? And I addressed this a little bit when I talked about Honoros and how we mistakenly used some symbolism that we probably should have been more aware of. I am sure that someone just said, "Oh, that looks like good religious art, reliquaries and artifacts. Let's throw some of those in." I do not believe we had any intention of blurring the line between religions in that situation, and probably we had some artists that just weren't aware that they were using a smorgasbord of aesthetics. Sorry, it was not intentional. It was, I'm pretty certain it was just someone's like, get me some things that look religious and throw them on a table.
You kind of answered this one before. What would be one improvement you would make to Undying now, 23 years later?
Bigger marketing budget.
Oh, there we go. Were there any plans for additional uses of consumables such as eater traps that felt a little bit, perhaps a little too situational?
Yeah, we had, we went a little crazy on, coming up with all these ideas, like things like the ether traps and stuff like that. We absolutely wanted to have more things that you could trap or stop with the ether traps. It was actually supposed to be, one, we built around the idea of how you could stop Aaron. If he was after you, you could actually trap him and get away for a while. He was a little bit like he was kind of like Nemesis from Resident Evil, where he could just kept on coming and kept on coming until you could finally find where he was located, right? So the ether traps were meant for that, but they're also meant for other things like the poltergeist throwing the knives at you and things like that. They were all going to be ways for us to basically, counter those things. And similarly, with a lot of those things, we had higher hopes of turning those things into more significant use cases. But as we started cutting down content, and also just we had too many ideas. It's the same reason we cut the second wheel of spells. We were trying to do too much. And so some of those things remained in game. Some of those things were underused. Some of those things you guys just found later and were able to dig up and say, hey, look at this cool thing that they had in here that we never used effectively. So I think it falls into the category of we had high hopes and we just weren't able to hit the mark on all those things.
Would Undying be successful if released today?
Well, I mean, you'd have to put it through the process of making it a modern game. I think the ideas of Undying, I think that the combination of magic and technology, I think that the narrative aspects that we were trying to tell, there's no reason those couldn't be successful now. Obviously, the production quality and a bunch of other things to make it competitive with games that are modern would be harder to do. Back then we were making kind of AAA content of what was defined at the time as like the high bar of quality. Things like Half-Life were more polished than we were, but we were in that space. Now to be in the space to make a AAA game, you're asking for $100 million plus to make a game that's competitive with the other games in the market. And my other concern is just I don't know as much if people are playing as many of the single player experiences like that, right? Everyone wants it to be games as service. Everyone wants it to be Game Pass and things like that. So between what the publisher wants and even what the audience wants, I'm not sure these games are successful. It's the reason I lament even, Titanfall 2 and us, I think, have a lot in common of like really great games that didn't get the sales that they deserved. And so I don't see any reason why the concepts of Undying couldn't be successful these days, but I would still say it'd be really hard to find a publisher for it.
Are you still in touch with some of the other developers?
Not at a high frequency of things. I'll bump into people at things like game developer conferences. Sometimes there'll be like a meetup around, LA, and I might bump into someone there. When E3 was, still a thing, I would see people there. At DICE, I see some people. It all blurs together a little bit now because I've been in the industry so long. I'm seeing people from all different games I've worked on, but definitely I still get the chance to bump into some of those people. And I also know that some of those people are still quite successful in the industry. So I'm happy for them.
And that marks the end of the Q&A. I appreciate your time and your answers, Roakana. Thank you for taking your time to answer these questions. And yeah.
Well, it was fun, and I very much appreciate you guys setting it up. And certainly, I am very stoked to see that there's still a passionate little community that still loves Undying and would take the time out to ask me questions. And so thank you all, guys. It's awesome. I'm super inspired, and I love that you guys are even trying to get the multiplayer working. So thank you.